The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow everything whole, where the wind carried stories of those who'd vanished into the wilderness and never returned. In a land where survival demanded every ounce of strength a person possessed, hope was a luxury few could afford to keep. For Thomas Brennan, hope had died 3 years ago in a wagon fire that took everything he loved, leaving him with nothing but ashes and the cruel mercy of memory. But fate had a way of rewriting even the stories we thought had ended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1876 had settled over the Montana Territory like a cold hand pressing down on the land. The aspens had turned gold weeks earlier, their leaves now mostly scattered across the rocky ground, and the first dusting of snow had already appeared on the distant peaks of the Crazy Mountains. Winter was coming early this year, the old-timers said, and Thomas Brennan believed them. He'd learned to read the signs after 8 years on this land. The way the elk moved down from the high country sooner than usual, how the ravens gathered in larger numbers, the thickness of the horses' winter coats already coming in strong. Thomas stood outside the barn of his small ranch, a spread of about 400 acres, nestled in a valley where Blacktail Creek cut through the prairie grassland. It wasn't much. A weathered cabin, a barn that needed new shingles, a corral that held 6 horses, and enough grazing land to support a modest herd of cattle. But it was his, built with his own hands from timber he'd hauled down from the mountains, every nail driven with purpose, every board placed with care. He'd come to Montana in 1868 with his new bride, full of dreams that seemed possible back then. Elizabeth had been 22, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and a laugh that could chase away the darkest thoughts. They'd met in St. Louis, where Thomas had been working as a freight handler, saving every penny for a chance at land of his own. Elizabeth worked in her father's dry goods store, and Thomas had found excuses to make purchases there far more often than necessary. She'd seen through him immediately, her green eyes sparkling with amusement as he stammered through another order for items he didn't need. Their courtship had been brief but certain. Elizabeth's father had disapproved. A freight handler wasn't the match he'd envisioned for his daughter, but Elizabeth had a stubborn streak that matched Thomas's own. When he'd proposed with a simple silver band he'd spent 3 months' wages on, she'd said yes before he'd even finished asking. They were married in April of 1868, and by May they were heading west with a wagon full of supplies and hearts full of determination. Those first years had been hard, but good. They'd lived in a tent while Thomas built the cabin, working from dawn until his hands bled and his back screamed. Elizabeth had worked beside him, mixing mud for chinking, helping to raise beams, never complaining even when the wind tore their tent stakes loose or when they went to bed hungry because the game had been scarce. She'd planted a garden that first spring, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil. And she'd learned to tan hides and preserve meat and do all the things frontier life demanded. By 1870, the cabin was finished and their small herd had grown to 30 head. Elizabeth was pregnant, and Thomas had never known such happiness existed. He'd lie awake at night with his hand on her belly, feeling the baby move, imagining a future he could almost touch. They'd chosen names, Samuel if it was a boy, Rose if it was a girl, and Elizabeth had sewn tiny clothes by lamplight, her face serene in the golden glow. But the baby came too early that winter, during a blizzard that lasted 4 days. Thomas had ridden through the storm to fetch the midwife from the nearest settlement, 15 miles away, but by the time they'd made it back, Elizabeth was unconscious from blood loss, and the baby, a girl, had never drawn breath. The midwife had done what she could, but infection had set in. Elizabeth had lingered for a week, delirious with fever, and then she was gone too. Thomas had buried them both on a hillside overlooking the valley under a cottonwood tree that Elizabeth had loved. He'd carved their names into simple wooden markers with shaking hands, and then he'd walked back to the empty cabin and hadn't spoken a word to another living soul for 3 months. The ranch had nearly failed that year. Thomas worked mechanically, tending the animals because they needed tending, fixing what broke because it needed fixing. But there was no life in him. Neighbors tried to help, the Andersons to the north, the Pritchards to the south, but Thomas turned them all away. He didn't want comfort. He didn't want company. He wanted to be left alone with his grief. Slowly, painfully, he'd built a new life from the ruins of the old one. Not a better life. There was no better without Elizabeth, but a functional one. He'd expanded his herd, hired seasonal help during roundup, sold his cattle at fair prices in Bozeman. He'd become known as a fair man who kept his word, if perhaps a bit too quiet, too solitary. He went to town only when necessary, spoke only when spoken to, and spent his evenings alone in the cabin that still felt too empty. Now, 3 years later, Thomas was 34 years old and felt twice that age. The work kept him strong. His shoulders were broad from throwing hay bales and wrestling steers, his hands calloused from ropes and reins. But there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and grey had started threading through his dark brown hair. He'd grown a beard more out of laziness than fashion, trimming it only when it got in the way of work. The loneliness had become a familiar companion, something he'd learned to carry like the weight of his saddle. He told himself he preferred it this way. No one to worry about, no one to lose. Just the land and the animals and the endless cycle of seasons. It was enough. It had to be enough. Thomas turned his attention back to the fence line he'd been mending. One of his mares, a dappled grey named Sage, had gotten tangled in the wire 2 days ago and torn down a section of fence in her panic. He'd treated her cuts, nothing too serious, thankfully, and now he was repairing the damage. The work was mindless, which suited him fine. Stretch the wire, secure it to the post, move to the next section. His thoughts could wander without consequence. The sky was beginning to darken when he heard the sound of hoofbeats. Thomas straightened, one hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept propped against the fence post. Visitors were rare this far from town, and unexpected visitors even rarer. He watched as a rider came into view, leading a second horse behind him. It was Doc Halstead from Bozeman, a man Thomas knew by reputation more than personal acquaintance. The doctor was in his 60s, with white hair and a face weathered by decades on the frontier. He'd been tending to the sick and injured in this territory since before Montana was even a territory, and everyone knew him as a man who'd ride through any weather to reach a patient. "Brennan," Doc Halstead called out as he approached, his voice carrying the weariness of a long ride. Thomas nodded in greeting, his eyes moving to the second horse. There was someone draped across the saddle, wrapped in blankets. From what little he could see, the person was small, a woman or a child. "Need your help," Doc said, dismounting with a grunt. "Found her 2 days ago, about 40 miles south of here. She was with a wagon train that got hit by Sioux raiders. Everyone else was killed." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Raiding parties had been a problem all summer, tensions running high after the Army's campaign in the Black Hills. Most wagon trains gave the area a wide berth now, but some folks were either too brave or too foolish to listen to warnings. "She's alive?" Thomas asked. "Barely. Took an arrow to the shoulder and another to the leg. They got the arrowheads out, but she's lost a lot of blood. Got fever too. I've done what I can, but I've got 3 more patients waiting for me in town, including a boy with a broken leg who needs surgery. I can't stay with her, and she can't make the ride to Bozeman in her condition." Thomas stared at the bundle on the horse, feeling a familiar resistance rising in his chest. He didn't want this. Didn't want someone else's problem, someone else's pain. His cabin was his sanctuary, his solitude carefully maintained. "Why bring her here?" he asked. Doc Halstead met his eyes steadily. "Because you're the closest ranch, and because I know you won't turn away someone who needs help, no matter how much you might want to." Thomas wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The doctor was right. Whatever walls Thomas had built around himself, they didn't extend to watching someone die when he could prevent it. "How long?" Thomas asked. "If the fever breaks, maybe a week before she can travel. If it doesn't—" Doc Halstead left the sentence unfinished. Thomas nodded slowly. "Bring her inside. Together, they carried the woman into the cabin. She was lighter than Thomas expected, her body thin beneath the blankets. They laid her on the bed, Thomas's bed, the only one in the cabin, and Doc Halstead unwrapped the coverings to check her wounds. Thomas got his first clear look at her face and felt something catch in his chest. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones too prominent, lips cracked and pale. But it was her stillness that struck him most, the absolute absence of any movement beyond the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. "She hasn't spoken a word since I found her," Doc said quietly, cleaning the wound on her shoulder with practiced efficiency. "Don't know if it's the shock or something else. Her tongue's intact, no obvious injury to her throat. But she's been silent as stone." Thomas watched as the doctor worked, noting the care with which he handled the injuries. The shoulder wound was angry and inflamed, the stitches holding, but the flesh around them red and swollen. The leg wound looked worse, the infection having spread further. "I'm leaving you laudanum for the pain and willow bark for the fever," Doc said, pulling supplies from his bag. "Keep the wounds clean, boiled water only. Change the dressings twice a day. Get fluids in her if you can, even if it's just a few spoonfuls at a time. Broth if she'll take it." He showed Thomas how to check for signs of worsening infection, how to administer the medicine, how to position her so the wounds could drain properly. Thomas absorbed the information mechanically, his mind already cataloguing what needed to be done, when Doc Halstead finally left, promising to return in 3 days if the weather held. Thomas stood in the doorway of his cabin and looked at the woman in his bed. The lamp cast shadows across her face, making her look even more ghostly. He'd saved a life today. He should feel something about that, satisfaction, purpose, anything. But all he felt was tired. Thomas moved to the stove and started preparing broth, his movements automatic. Outside, night had fully fallen, and the wind was picking up. He could hear the horses moving restlessly in the barn, sensing the weather change. There'd be frost by morning, maybe snow. He glanced back at the woman. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Who was she? What was her name? What had she been doing with that wagon train? The questions rose and fell away, unanswered. Thomas had learned not to ask too many questions about the past. The past was full of ghosts, and he had enough of his own. He settled into the chair beside the bed with a cup of coffee, preparing for a long night. The broth simmered on the stove, and the lamp burned low. And outside, the wind sang its lonely song across the prairie. This was his life now, solitary, uncomplicated, safe. He told himself he preferred it this way. But somewhere in the back of his mind, so faint he could almost ignore it, was the uncomfortable awareness that nothing stayed the same forever. The land changed. The seasons turned. And sometimes, whether you wanted it or not, the past found ways to reach forward and pull you back. Thomas pushed the thought away and focused on the work at hand. Keep her alive. Get her well enough to leave. Return to his solitude, simple, straightforward, no complications. He didn't yet know how wrong he was. The fever came in waves that first night, each one worse than the last. Thomas sat beside the bed, watching the woman's face contort with pain, even in unconsciousness, her body drenched in sweat despite the cool air. He changed the cloths on her forehead every few minutes, dipping them in cold water from the basin, but it seemed to make little difference. Her skin burned hot enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her without even touching. Around midnight, she started convulsing. Thomas had seen fever seizures before in cattle, but never in a person, and the violence of it shocked him. Her back arched off the bed, muscles rigid, jaw clenched so tight he feared she'd crack her teeth. He held her shoulders down as gently as he could, trying to keep her from thrashing and reopening her wounds, feeling utterly helpless as the seizure ran its course. When it finally stopped, she went completely limp. For a terrible moment, Thomas thought she'd died. He pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, and nearly collapsed with relief when he felt the flutter of it beneath his fingertips. Weak, but there. He spent the rest of that night in the chair, afraid to sleep, checking her breathing every few minutes. The laudanum Doc Halstead had left was supposed to ease her pain, but Thomas couldn't get any of it into her. She was too deeply unconscious to swallow, and he didn't dare force it for fear she'd choke. Dawn came grey and cold. Thomas stood and stretched, his back protesting from hours in the chair. He needed to tend the animals, but he was reluctant to leave her alone. What if another seizure came? What if she stopped breathing? But the horses needed feeding, and the cattle needed checking. Ranch work didn't pause for emergencies. Thomas compromised by working as quickly as possible, rushing through his morning chores and checking on her between each task. She remained unconscious throughout, her breathing shallow and rapid, her fever showing no signs of breaking. By noon, Thomas was exhausted and worried. He'd managed to get a few spoonfuls of willow bark tea into her mouth, tilting her head back carefully and letting the liquid trickle down her throat. She'd swallowed reflexively, which he took as a good sign, but she still hadn't opened her eyes or shown any awareness of her surroundings. He changed her dressings, as Doc Halstead had instructed, steeling himself before unwrapping the bandages. The shoulder wound looked marginally better, still inflamed, but perhaps not quite as angry. The leg wound was worse. The flesh around it had taken on a greyish tinge that made Thomas's stomach turn. He cleaned it as thoroughly as he dared, using boiled water and the carbolic solution the doctor had left, then applied fresh bandages with hands that weren't quite steady. As he worked, he found himself studying her face more closely. There was something about the shape of her jaw, the line of her nose, that nagged at him with an uncomfortable familiarity. But that was impossible. He didn't know this woman. He'd never seen her before Doc Halstead brought her to his cabin. Still, the feeling persisted. Thomas tried to push it aside and focus on practical matters. She needed more fluids. He prepared a thin broth from beef bones and managed to get nearly a cup of it into her over the course of the afternoon, one careful spoonful at a time. It was tedious, painstaking work, and twice she choked, and he had to sit her up and pat her back until she could breathe clearly again. As evening approached, Thomas realized he'd gotten almost nothing done around the ranch. The fences still needed mending, firewood needed splitting, and he'd meant to ride out and check on the herd in the north pasture. All of it would have to wait. The woman's care was consuming every moment. He found himself resenting her for it, then immediately felt guilty. It wasn't her fault raiders had attacked her wagon train. It wasn't her fault Doc Halstead had brought her here. She was fighting for her life, and he was irritated about missed chores. The second night was worse than the first. The fever spiked again around 10 o'clock, and this time the convulsions lasted longer. Thomas held her down, murmuring words he didn't even hear himself saying, watching helplessly as her body fought battles he couldn't see. When the seizure finally released her, she made a sound, a low, keening moan that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Then she spoke. The words were unintelligible at first, mumbled and slurred, but Thomas caught fragments. Names, he thought, places, bits of sentences that made no sense strung together. She was delirious, lost in whatever fever dreams had claimed her mind. Thomas leaned closer, trying to make out what she was saying. Most of it was gibberish, but then she said something that stopped his heart. Thomas, his name. Clear as day. She'd said his name. He told himself it was a coincidence. Thomas was a common name. She could be calling for anyone, a brother, a father, a husband. It didn't mean anything, but his hands were shaking as he dipped the cloth in cold water again. She continued muttering throughout the night, sometimes crying, sometimes seeming to argue with invisible people. Thomas caught more fragments, something about a fire, about pain, about being alone. Once she said baby so clearly and with such anguish that Thomas had to look away, his own old wounds tearing open. By the third morning, Thomas was running on pure stubbornness. He'd managed maybe 4 hours of sleep total across 2 nights, grabbed in 15-minute increments in the chair. His eyes burned with exhaustion, and his hands had started to tremble from the coffee he'd been consuming to stay awake. But something had changed. The woman's fever had dropped slightly, not broken, but lower than it had been. Her breathing seemed easier, and her face had lost some of that waxen quality. Thomas allowed himself a small measure of hope. He was changing her dressings when it happened. As he lifted her shoulder to wrap fresh bandaging underneath, her eyes opened. Thomas froze, meeting her gaze for the first time. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with green and gold, and in that moment they were filled with confusion and pain. She stared at him without recognition, without any apparent comprehension of where she was or who he was. Then her eyes rolled back, and she was unconscious again. But it was progress. Thomas felt something unclench in his chest. She'd been aware, even if only for a few seconds. She was coming back. Over the next 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness with increasing frequency. Sometimes her eyes would open, and she'd look around the cabin with that same confused expression. Sometimes she'd stare directly at Thomas, but show no sign of seeing him. She never spoke during these periods, never made a sound beyond the occasional whimper of pain. Thomas fell into a routine. Morning chores are done as quickly as possible. Check her wounds, change dressings, assess the infection. Get fluids into her, broth, water, willow bark tea. Talk to her, even though she didn't respond, because Doc Halstead had mentioned once that unconscious people sometimes heard things. Evening chores, more fluids, night vigil in the chair. The ranch suffered from his inattention. Thomas knew it, but couldn't bring himself to care. Let the fences wait. Let the firewood pile run low. This woman, whoever she was, needed him more. On the 4th day, Doc Halstead returned as promised. He examined her thoroughly, nodding with satisfaction at the shoulder wound, but frowning over the leg. Infection's stubborn, he said. But she's fighting. Stronger than she looks. She opened her eyes, Thomas told him. Couple of times. Hasn't spoken, though. Doc Halstead nodded thoughtfully. The silence worries me. Physical wounds heal. But whatever she saw when those raiders came, he trailed off, shaking his head. Mine can fracture under that kind of horror. Seen it in soldiers after bad battles. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't. After the doctor left, Thomas sat in his chair and studied the woman again. She was sleeping now, her breathing steady and even. The fever had broken completely the night before, and though she was still dangerously weak, she'd turned a corner. He tried again to place why she seemed familiar. It was maddening, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. The shape of her face, the curve of her cheekbone, even the way her hair fell across the pillow, all of it whispered of something he should know, but couldn't quite grasp. That evening, she woke while Thomas was spooning broth into her mouth. Her eyes opened and focused on him with more clarity than he'd seen yet. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're safe, Thomas said quietly. You're at my ranch. Doc Halstead brought you here. You were hurt, but you're going to be all right. She continued staring at him, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, fear, he couldn't tell. Then her eyes closed again and she was asleep. But this time, Thomas was certain she'd understood him. The next morning, she was awake when Thomas came in from his chores. She was lying exactly as he'd left her, but her eyes were open and tracking his movements as he crossed to the stove. Thomas felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of his mud-covered boots and the smell of the barn clinging to his clothes. "Morning," he said, not sure what else to say. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Thomas poured water into a cup and brought it to her. "I think you can drink on your own." He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. She was weak as a newborn calf, her arms trembling with the effort of lifting the cup. Thomas steadied her hands with his own, guiding the cup to her lips. She drank slowly, carefully, and when she'd finished, she leaned back against the pillows, looking exhausted from even that small effort. "I can make you something to eat," Thomas offered. "Broth, or maybe some eggs if you think you can handle it." She shook her head slightly, the first clear communication she'd given. "Later then," Thomas said. "You need to get your strength back." He busied himself with morning tasks, trying not to stare at her, but finding his eyes drawn back repeatedly. Now that she was conscious, really conscious, the questions multiplied. Who was she? Where had she been going? Did she have family looking for her? And underneath all those questions, the one he didn't want to ask, why did looking at her make his chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to recognition? Over the following days, a strange sort of routine developed. The woman remained silent, never speaking a word, but she was increasingly aware and present. She watched Thomas move around the cabin, her eyes following him with an intensity that was sometimes unnerving. When he helped her sit up to eat or drink, she would meet his gaze briefly before looking away, and in those moments, Thomas felt certain she was trying to tell him something. Her wounds were healing well now. The infection in her leg had finally begun to recede, and the shoulder wound was closing cleanly. She was gaining strength too, slowly but noticeably. By the end of the first week, she could sit up on her own for short periods. By the middle of the second week, she could stand with Thomas's support, though walking was still beyond her. Thomas found himself talking to her more than he'd talked to anyone in years. It was easier somehow knowing she wouldn't respond. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about the weather and the work that needed doing. He didn't talk about the past, his past or hers, but about the immediate, the practical, the safe. Sometimes, though, he'd catch her looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Sadness, maybe, or longing, or something else entirely. It made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't name. One afternoon, as he was helping her back to the bed, after a brief walk around the cabin, his hand brushed against her arm, and she flinched away violently. Thomas stepped back immediately, hands raised. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean—" She shook her head quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. Her eyes had gone wide, almost panicked, and Thomas could see her breathing had quickened. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." The panic faded from her eyes, replaced by something that might have been shame. She wouldn't look at him as he helped her settle back onto the bed. And the silence between them felt different than before, heavier, charged with unspoken things. That night, Thomas lay in his bedroll on the floor and stared at the ceiling. He'd given her the bed without question, sleeping on the hard floor with only a thin blanket between him and the wood. His back ached and his muscles protested, but it seemed wrong to ask an injured woman to sleep on the floor. He thought about her flinch earlier, about the fear in her eyes. What had those raiders done to her? What had she seen? The not knowing gnawed at him, but he couldn't ask. She couldn't or wouldn't answer. Sleep was slow in coming. The cabin was quiet, except for the sound of her breathing, steady and even from the bed. Thomas found himself matching his breath to hers, and somewhere in that rhythm he finally drifted off. He dreamed of Elizabeth that night for the first time in months. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin, the sunlight behind her turning her auburn hair to fire. She was smiling at him, but when he tried to move toward her, she shook her head. "Not yet," she said, her voice clear as bells. "You're not ready yet." Thomas woke with tears on his face and Elizabeth's name on his lips. The cabin was dark, the fire burned down to embers. From the bed, he heard the woman shift, and he wondered if she was awake, if she'd heard him. He didn't check. Some things were too private to share. The next morning brought the first real snow of the season. Thomas woke to a world transformed, everything covered in a thick blanket of white that muffled all sound. The horses were restless in the barn, not liking the sudden change in weather, and the cattle had bunched together in the south pasture, seeking shelter against the wind. Inside the cabin, the woman was sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the falling snow. There was something in her expression that made Thomas pause in the doorway, something wistful and sad. "First snow," he said, stamping his boots on the threshold to knock off the accumulated white. "It'll be a hard winter, I think." She turned to look at him, and Thomas felt that jolt of familiarity again, stronger this time. Something about the angle of her face in the morning light, the way the grey sky outside painted shadows beneath her cheekbones. He knew her. The certainty hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He knew her, but that was impossible. He knew it was impossible, even as every instinct screamed that it was true. Thomas crossed to the stove, needing something to do with his hands. He poured coffee with fingers that had gone numb, his mind racing. He was imagining things. The isolation, the sleepless nights, the stress of caring for her. It was making him see connections that didn't exist. But when he turned back and saw her watching him with those hazel eyes, he knew it wasn't his imagination. "What's your name?" he asked, the words coming out rougher than he intended. She didn't answer. Just looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Can you tell me your name?" He tried again, gentler this time. Still nothing. But something in her eyes, a flash of pain, of fear, of something else he couldn't identify, told him she'd understood the question. Thomas set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Someone out there is looking for you. People who care about you. They deserve to know you're alive." At that she looked away, her jaw tightening. Thomas saw her hands clench in the blankets, knuckles going white. "I'm trying to help you," he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "But I can't do that if you won't talk to me. I don't even know what to call you." The silence stretched between them, taut as a rope about to snap. Thomas was about to turn away when she moved. Slowly, painfully, she reached for the small wooden table beside the bed. Thomas had left a pencil and paper there, thinking maybe she could write if she wouldn't speak. She picked up the pencil with trembling fingers. For a long moment she stared at the blank paper. Then, with movements that looked like they cost her everything, she began to write. Thomas moved closer, watching the words take shape. Her handwriting was shaky but legible, letters forming with agonizing slowness. When she finished, she dropped the pencil as if it had burned her and turned her face away. Thomas picked up the paper and read what she'd written. 3 words. Just 3 words, but they changed everything. "I don't remember." Thomas stared at those words until they blurred. Memory loss, of course. That explained the silence, the confusion, the way she looked at him sometimes, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "You don't remember your name?" he asked carefully. "Or you don't remember what happened?" She reached for the paper again, her hand shaking worse than before. She wrote 2 more words. Either, both. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Total memory loss. Doc Halstead had mentioned the mind could break under trauma, but Thomas hadn't imagined this. She'd lost everything, her past, her identity, herself. "Do you remember anything?" he asked. "Anything at all?" She wrote a fire, screaming, pain, then nothing, the raiders. She remembered the attack, but nothing before it. Thomas's mind raced through the implications. If she couldn't remember who she was, how would anyone find her? How would she find her way back to whatever life she'd had before? He looked at her again, really looked at her, and felt that nagging familiarity intensify into something almost painful. The shape of her face, the color of her eyes, the way she held herself even injured and afraid, all of it whispered of someone he'd known, someone he'd loved. But that was insane. Elizabeth was dead. He'd buried her 3 years ago. He'd watched them lower her coffin into the ground and shovel dirt over it with his own hands. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't Elizabeth. Couldn't be Elizabeth. Yet the resemblance was impossible to ignore now that he'd acknowledged it. The same build, slim but strong. The same height. The same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Small things, details he'd forced himself to forget, now coming back with brutal clarity. "Rest," Thomas said abruptly, needing distance. "I need to see the animals." He grabbed his coat and nearly fled the cabin, plunging out into the snow without bothering to properly bundle up. The cold hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it, needed it. Anything to clear his head. This was grief playing tricks on him, nothing more. He'd spent 3 years learning to live without Elizabeth, and now his starving heart was trying to find her in the face of a stranger. It was pathetic and wrong, and he needed to stop. But as Thomas worked through his chores, hands going numb in the freezing air, one question kept circling back. What if he wasn't imagining it? What if, by some impossible miracle, the woman in his cabin really was his wife? And if she was, If by some twist of fate Elizabeth had survived, how could he possibly tell her that he'd given up on her? That he'd buried an empty coffin and moved on with his life? How could he tell her that he'd already mourned her death? The snow continued to fall, covering everything in pristine white, burying the world under layers of forgetfulness. Inside the cabin, a woman with no name tried to remember who she was. And outside, a man who thought he'd lost everything tried to convince himself he was wrong. Neither of them knew that the truth, when it finally came, would be harder than either silence or grief. The storm was just beginning. 3 days after the snow, Doc Halstead returned to check on his patient. Thomas had been expecting him, had spent those 3 days rehearsing how he'd explain his growing suspicion without sounding like a madman. But when the moment came, standing in the cabin doorway while the doctor examined the woman, the words died in his throat. How could he say it? How could he look another man in the eye and claim that this stranger might be his dead wife? Doc Halstead would think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Wounds are healing beautifully, the doctor said, rewrapping the bandages on her leg. You've done good work, Brennan. She's lucky you were here. The woman sat motionless on the bed, her eyes downcast. She'd been like that since Thomas came back inside, withdrawn, almost absent, as if she could make herself invisible through sheer will. Doc, Thomas said carefully. She can't remember anything. Not her name, not where she came from. Nothing before the attack. Halstead's hand stilled. He looked at the woman with new concern, then back at Thomas. Memory loss isn't uncommon after severe trauma. Sometimes it comes back in pieces, sometimes... He didn't finish the sentence. Sometimes it doesn't, Thomas finished for him. The doctor nodded slowly. I've seen men after battles who never recovered what they'd lost. The mind protects itself in strange ways. He turned to the woman, speaking gently. Can you read? She nodded once. That's something at least. Motor skills, basic cognition, those are intact. It's just the personal memories that are gone. He pulled a chair close to the bed. Do you remember anything at all, miss? Faces, places, even feelings or impressions? She reached for the paper and pencil Thomas had left nearby. Her hand was steadier now than it had been days ago. She wrote quickly and handed the paper to the doctor. Halstead read it aloud. I remember fire and fear. I remember thinking I was going to die. Everything before that is darkness. And since you woke up here, the doctor prompted. She wrote again, everything is clear. I remember every moment since opening my eyes in this cabin. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. She remembered the present but had lost the past entirely. What kind of cruelty was that? Doc Halstead spent another hour with her, asking questions, testing her responses, trying to find any crack in the wall of forgetting. But there was nothing. Finally, he packed his bag and gestured for Thomas to follow him outside. The cold hit them immediately. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, the kind of sky that promised bitter nights ahead. Halstead's horse stamped impatiently, eager to move and stay warm. What am I supposed to do with her? Thomas asked, keeping his voice low even though there was no way she could hear them through the cabin walls. What do you mean? She can't stay here indefinitely. People will talk. Halstead gave him a long look. People are already talking. You think nobody noticed me coming out here multiple times? Mrs. Pritchard asked me point blank last week what I was treating you for. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. The Pritchards' ranch was 5 miles south. Close enough that Ruth Pritchard probably had every detail memorized for sharing at the next church social. What did you tell her? The truth. That I had a patient out here who'd been injured in a raid. She asked if it was a man or a woman. Halstead paused. I told her it wasn't any of her business. That won't stop the gossip. No, the doctor agreed. It won't, but Thomas, what's the alternative? She's got nowhere to go. No family we can locate, no name we can trace. You're going to send her to Bozeman. Put her in a boarding house where she'll be preyed upon by every opportunist who realizes she's vulnerable. Thomas looked back at the cabin. Through the window he could see the woman's silhouette, still sitting on the bed. Maybe someone's looking for her. Someone from that wagon train who survived. I checked. No survivors besides her, and the wagon master's records burned with the wagons. We don't even know which train it was or where they were headed. I've sent telegrams to forts and settlements all along the route, but Halstead shook his head. Finding her people will be like finding a specific snowflake in a blizzard. So what do I do? The doctor studied him with eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. You let her stay until we figure something else out. And you ignore the wagging tongues, because that's all they are, tongues with nothing better to do than flap. After Halstead left, Thomas stood outside in the cold longer than necessary. The cattle were visible in the distance, dark shapes against white snow, and smoke rose from the Anderson place to the north. Normal life continuing as it always did, but his life was anything but normal now. When he finally went back inside, the woman was standing by the window. It was the first time he'd seen her on her feet without help, and for a moment he just watched her. She was thinner than she should be, the borrowed shirt and trousers he'd given her hanging loose on her frame. Her dark hair, clean now from the washing he'd helped her with days ago, fell past her shoulders in waves that caught the afternoon light. Elizabeth's hair had been auburn, not dark brown. Elizabeth had been slightly taller, her frame a bit more substantial. But the way this woman stood, the angle of her shoulders, the tilt of her head as she looked out at the snow. "You should be resting," Thomas said, more roughly than he intended. She turned to face him, and he saw she'd been crying. Silent tears had left tracks down her face, and her eyes were red-rimmed. But she made no sound, no explanation for the tears. Thomas felt something crack inside him. "I'm sorry," he said, softer now. "This isn't your fault." "None of it." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, then moved slowly back toward the bed. Each step was careful, measured, and Thomas could see the effort it cost her. He wanted to help, but sensed she needed to do this herself. When she was settled, she reached for the paper again. Thomas waited while she wrote, watching her face contort with concentration or perhaps pain. She held up what she'd written. "What happens to me now?" It was the question Thomas had been avoiding, the one that kept him awake at night. "You stay here until you're fully healed. Until we find your people, or until—" He trailed off, she wrote. "Until what?" "Until you remember," Thomas finished, though he wasn't sure that was what he'd meant to say. She stared at the words she'd written, then at him. There was something in her expression, a desperate need to understand, to place herself in the world. Finally she wrote again, "What if I never remember?" Thomas had no answer for that. The next week brought a cold snap that froze the creek solid and sent the temperature plummeting so low that ice formed on the inside of the cabin windows. Thomas spent his days breaking ice so the animals could drink, hauling extra feed to keep the cattle's body heat up, and trying to keep the cabin warm enough that they didn't freeze at night. The woman grew stronger daily. By the end of the week she could walk unassisted, though she tired easily. She started helping with small tasks, folding clothes, washing dishes, keeping the fire fed. Thomas hadn't asked her to, but she did it anyway, moving through the cabin with quiet determination. They developed a rhythm of existence that was almost companionable. Thomas would come in from the cold, and she'd have coffee waiting. She'd struggle with a task, and he'd help without making her feel helpless. They communicated through gestures, brief notes, and the language of shared space, but the silence between them was full of questions neither could answer. Thomas caught himself watching her constantly, cataloguing every gesture, every expression, comparing them to memories he'd tried so hard to bury. The way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. The slight furrow between her eyebrows when she was frustrated. Elizabeth had done all those things. But Elizabeth had also hummed while she worked, had laughed at his terrible jokes, had talked incessantly about her plans for the ranch. This woman was silent as stone, her presence marked by absence rather than sound. How could they be the same person? They couldn't. It was impossible. Yet doubt gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The matter came to a head 10 days after the snow when Jacob Anderson rode up to the cabin. Thomas saw him coming from a distance and felt his stomach drop. Anderson was a good neighbor, a decent man. But his wife, Margaret, was the unofficial keeper of community morality. And she wouldn't have sent her husband without reason. Thomas met Anderson outside, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. "Jacob," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "What brings you out in this cold?" Anderson dismounted, his expression uncomfortable. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and grey-bearded, the kind who looked more at home on a horse than on his own feet. "Thomas, I'm going to be straight with you because that's how I am. Margaret's got herself in a state about the situation here." "What situation?"
Come on now.
"The woman living in your cabin. Doc Halstead told Ruth Pritchard about her, Ruth told Margaret, and now half the territory probably knows you've got an unmarried woman under your roof." Anderson held up a hand before Thomas could speak. "I know it's not like that. Doc explained about the raid, about her injuries. But Margaret thinks, well, she thinks people will talk. Let them talk. It's not that simple. Margaret's organizing a committee. Women from the church. They want to come out here and assess the situation." Thomas felt anger flash hot in his chest. "Assess the situation? She's not in a situation. She's a person who nearly died." "I know that," Anderson said, his voice patient. "But Margaret's got it in her head that the woman needs proper female supervision, that it's not decent for her to be alone with you, unmarried as you both are. She has no memory, Jacob. She doesn't even know her own name. How is she supposed to make decisions about where she stays?" Anderson shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret mentioned something about the church taking her in, or finding her a position as a domestic somewhere proper. A domestic position. She can barely walk across the room without needing to rest. She's got scars that'll last the rest of her life. And do you want to ship her off to be someone's servant?" "I don't want anything, Thomas. I'm just delivering the message. Margaret and her committee will be here the day after tomorrow." After Anderson left, Thomas stood in the cold fury and frustration warring in his chest. The hypocrisy of it burned. He'd saved this woman's life, cared for her when no one else would, and now they wanted to judge him for it. Wanted to uproot her again because it wasn't proper. He went back inside to find her standing by the window, watching Anderson ride away. She turned to look at him, and Thomas saw the question in her eyes. "Neighbors," he said shortly. "Apparently we're causing a scandal." She reached for paper and wrote, "Because I'm here. Because you're here and you're a woman, and I'm not married, and apparently that's a crime against decency." She looked down at what she'd written, then wrote more. "Where will I go?" The simple desperation of that question undid him. Thomas crossed the room and knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. "You're not going anywhere unless you want to. This is your home as long as you need it to be." She searched his face, and Thomas saw tears forming in her eyes again. She wrote shakily, "Why are you helping me?" "Because I think you might be my wife. Because looking at you breaks my heart and gives me hope in equal measure. Because 3 years ago I buried the woman I loved, and now I'm starting to believe I was wrong." But he couldn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "Because it's the right thing to do." She shook her head and wrote again, underlining the words, "There's more." "I see it in how you look at me." Thomas felt his breath catch. She'd noticed. Of course she'd noticed. He stood abruptly, needing distance. "You remind me of someone." "That's all? Who?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she already knew the answer. Or suspected it, at least. "My wife," he said finally, the words like stones in his mouth. "You remind me of my wife. She died 3 years ago." The woman's hand went to her throat, an unconscious gesture of shock. She wrote rapidly, "Is that why you're helping me? Because I look like her?" "No, yes, I don't know." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, frustration making his voice harsh. "At first, I didn't notice. But the longer you're here, the more I see similarities. The way you move. Small things. It's probably nothing. Grief playing tricks." She stared at him for a long moment, then wrote, "What was her name?" "Elizabeth." She mouthed the name silently, trying it on like a coat that might or might not fit. Then she wrote, "Do you think I'm her?" The directness of the question stole his breath. Thomas wanted to lie, to dismiss it as impossible. But he found he couldn't. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I'm losing my mind. But part of me—" He couldn't finish. She wrote, "Tell me about her." So Thomas did. He sat down and told her about Elizabeth, about meeting her in St. Louis, about their journey west, about building the cabin and starting the ranch. He told her about the pregnancy, about the baby that came too early, about the infection and the fever and the terrible week of watching her slip away. He told her about the burial, about the 3 years since, about the loneliness and the grief and the slow process of learning to survive rather than live. The woman listened without moving, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached for the paper one more time. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the pencil, but she managed to write, "I wish I could tell you if I'm her. I know. What if I am? What if I'm not? How do we know?" Thomas had no answer. The questions had been haunting him for days, circling endlessly with no resolution. There might be ways. Scars, birthmarks, things you'd know about Elizabeth that a stranger wouldn't, but memory loss could explain not knowing them. She nodded slowly, then wrote, "Or I'm just someone who happens to look like your dead wife. And this is all coincidence. Maybe." They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded and the cabin grew dim. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Winter was tightening its grip, and with it came the pressure of decisions that couldn't be delayed forever. Finally, the woman wrote, "The women who are coming. What will they want? To judge us, to decide what's proper, to take you away from here if they think it's necessary." She looked at him steadily, and in her hazel eyes, Thomas saw something that might have been fear or might have been determination. She wrote, "I don't want to leave. Then you won't. I won't let them force you. But the scandal, I don't give a damn about scandal. You need time to heal, time to figure out who you are. You deserve that much." She stared at what he'd said, then at him. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over his, the first time she'd voluntarily touched him since she'd flinched away days ago. Her fingers were cold, but steady. She wrote one more thing with her free hand, the letters large and clear. "Thank you." Thomas looked down at her hand on his and felt something shift inside him. Whatever happened next, whether she was Elizabeth or a stranger, whether the town approved or condemned him, didn't matter as much as this moment. This quiet gesture of trust from a woman who had every reason to trust no one. "You're welcome," he said softly. That night, Thomas lay in his bedroll on the floor and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he'd need to prepare for the committee's visit. He'd need to clean the cabin, make sure everything looked proper and respectable. He'd need to find words to explain the unexplainable, to defend choices that needed no defense. But tonight, in the darkness, he allowed himself to imagine the impossible. What if she really was Elizabeth? What if, by some miracle he couldn't begin to understand, his wife had survived? The fire that killed her, or that he'd thought killed her, had been in a small cabin during a difficult birth. There had been so much confusion, so much blood. The midwife had been certain, but what if she'd been wrong? What if the body they'd buried hadn't been Elizabeth at all? The questions multiplied faster than he could sort them. But underneath all of them was one simple truth. Whoever this woman was, whatever her past, she mattered to him now. Not because she might be Elizabeth, but because she was herself, brave and broken and fighting to survive in a world that had stripped everything from her. If she was Elizabeth, he'd love her all over again. If she wasn't, he might love her anyway. The realization terrified him more than any judgment the town could pass. From the bed, he heard her shift, restless in sleep or perhaps awake like him. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it might as well have been miles. So much separated them, memory, identity, grief, uncertainty, but also so little. Just silence and darkness and the fragile hope that somehow, despite everything, they'd find their way through to whatever truth waited on the other side. Morning would bring the committee, bring judgment and questions and pressure to conform. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Thomas let himself believe that impossible. Things might still be possible, that the dead might return, that love might get a second chance, that a woman with no past and a man haunted by his might somehow build a future neither had dared to hope for outside. The wind howled its ancient song, indifferent to human struggles. Inside, Two people lay awake in the darkness, each wondering if the other held the key to mysteries they couldn't solve alone. The storm was far from over, but for the first time since it began, Thomas thought they might survive it. Together. Margaret Anderson arrived precisely at 10 o'clock the following morning, bringing with her Ruth Pritchard and two other women Thomas vaguely recognized from church socials he'd stopped attending years ago. They came in a wagon, dressed in their Sunday best despite the muddy roads, their faces set with the grim determination of women on a moral mission. Thomas had spent the dawn hours making the cabin as presentable as possible, though he wasn't sure what standard he was preparing for. He'd swept the floors, organized the shelves, and moved his bedroll into the corner where it might be less obvious that he'd been sleeping on the floor. The woman had watched his preparations with growing anxiety, her hands twisting together in her lap. When the knock came, she stood instinctively, then swayed with the sudden movement. Thomas steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and she looked up at him with fear plain in her eyes. "It'll be all right," he said. Wishing he believed it, Margaret swept in first, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the cabin in a single glance. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, tall and imposing, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Ruth Pritchard followed, smaller and rounder, her expression eager with the prospect of scandal. The other two women, Sarah Collins and her daughter Emma, Thomas remembered now, hung back near the door. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret said, her voice formal, "I trust you know why we're here." "Jacob mentioned you had concerns," Thomas replied carefully. "Concerns hardly covers it." Margaret's gaze swept to the woman standing beside Thomas. "And this is the unfortunate soul we've heard about." The woman nodded but didn't step forward. Thomas felt her fingers tighten on his arm. "Can she speak?" Ruth Pritchard asked, leaning forward with undisguised curiosity. "She can hear you just fine," Thomas said, more sharply than he intended. "She was injured in a raid. She's lost her memory, and her voice hasn't come back yet. But she can write." Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained rigid. "I see. And what arrangements have been made for her care?" "I've been caring for her." "Doc Holstead's been checking on her progress?" "Yes, so we've heard." Margaret moved closer, addressing the woman directly now. "My dear, I'm Margaret Anderson. We're here from the church to help. You must understand that this situation, while I'm sure Mr. Brennan has acted with the best intentions, is highly irregular. An unmarried woman living alone with an unmarried man, it simply isn't done." The woman reached for the paper and pencil Thomas had made sure to keep nearby. She wrote quickly and held it up. "He saved my life. I have nowhere else to go." "We understand that," Sarah Collins said gently. She was younger than Margaret, with kind eyes and a softer demeanor. "And we're grateful to Mr. Brennan for his charity. But now that you're recovering, we need to consider more appropriate arrangements." "What arrangements?" Thomas asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Margaret turned to him. "The church has a small fund for those in need. We can arrange for her to stay at the boarding house in Bozeman until we can locate her family or find her suitable employment." "She's not strong enough for that yet," Thomas protested. "She can barely walk the length of this cabin without needing to rest." "Then we wait until she's strong enough," Margaret said firmly. "But Mr. Brennan, surely you see that she cannot continue living here indefinitely. Your reputation, and more importantly hers, depends on proper supervision." The woman was writing again, her movements sharp and angry. She held up the paper. "I don't need supervision. I need time to heal and remember who I am." "And you'll have that time, dear," Ruth Pritchard said in a tone that made Thomas's jaw clench. "But you'll have it in a proper Christian environment, not alone in a bachelor's cabin." "This is my home," Thomas said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "She's my guest. And with all due respect, ladies, what happens under my roof is my business." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Brennan, we're trying to help. But if you're unwilling to see reason, the church elders will need to become involved. There are standards in this community, and they exist for good reason." The woman suddenly stepped forward, pulling away from Thomas. She moved slowly but with purpose, positioning herself between him and the committee. She wrote something and held it up, her hand steady despite the obvious effort it cost her. Would it be proper if we were married? The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas felt the floor drop out from under him. Margaret's mouth opened and closed without sound. Even Ruth Pritchard, never at a loss for words, seemed stunned. "That's—" Margaret began, then stopped. "That would certainly change things. Are you suggesting—" The woman turned to look at Thomas, and in her eyes he saw desperation mixed with determination. She was offering him a solution, the only one that would satisfy the moral gatekeepers while keeping her here, safe, while she healed and searched for her lost identity. It was insane. They barely knew each other. She might be Elizabeth, or she might be a complete stranger. Either way, marrying her would be more scandalous than the current situation, more complicated than having her shipped off to Bozeman, where she'd be vulnerable and alone. Thomas found himself speaking before he'd fully thought it through. "If that's what she wants, then yes. We'll marry." The women erupted into a flurry of whispered conversation. Margaret held up a hand for silence, her expression calculating. This is highly unusual. The woman doesn't even know her own name. How can she consent to marriage? "She can write," Thomas said. "She can make her wishes known." "And she just did. Mr. Brennan," Sarah Collins said gently, "forgive me, but are you certain this is wise? Marriage is a sacred bond, not a solution to a social problem. I'm aware of what marriage is, Mrs. Collins, and I'm also aware that this woman needs protection and time, neither of which she'll get if you ship her off to Bozeman." The woman was writing again. She showed what she'd written to the committee. "I know this is strange, but I trust Thomas. He's been kind when he didn't have to be. If marriage will let me stay here until I remember who I am, then I choose that." Margaret studied the paper, then the woman, then Thomas. Her expression was unreadable. Finally she said, "Very well, but there will be conditions. The marriage must happen quickly, within the week. Pastor Reynolds will need to meet with you both beforehand, and Mrs. Collins will visit weekly to ensure proper arrangements are being maintained." It was a compromise, Thomas realized. Not what Margaret had come here intending, but better than the alternative of public scandal. She could return to town and report that the situation had been handled appropriately, that propriety had been maintained. "Agreed," Thomas said. After the women left, the cabin felt too quiet. Thomas stood by the window, watching their wagon disappear down the road, trying to process what had just happened. He'd agreed to marry a woman whose name he didn't know, a woman who might be his dead wife or might be a stranger, a woman who'd been under his roof less than 3 weeks. He heard her move and turned to find her sitting at the table, writing. When she finished, she held it up. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do." "Don't apologize. You were right. It's the only solution that keeps you here, but it's not fair to you. You didn't ask for this." Thomas crossed to the table and sat down across from her. "Neither did you. You didn't ask to be attacked. You didn't ask to lose your memory. You didn't ask for any of this." He paused. "At least this way you have time. Time to heal. Time to remember. And if you never do remember, you'll still have a home here." She looked at him with those hazel eyes, and Thomas saw tears forming. She wrote, "What if I'm not her? What if I'm not Elizabeth?" "Then you're not. And that's all right, is it? You'll be married to a stranger." Thomas thought about that. About Elizabeth, about grief, about the strange possibility that had been haunting him for weeks. Maybe we're all strangers at first. Elizabeth and I, we barely knew each other when we married. We learned from each other as we went. That's different. You chose each other, and you just chose this. That's enough." She wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears she couldn't seem to control. Then she wrote, "We need to give me a name. I can't marry you as the woman with no name." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Naming her felt like an admission that she wasn't Elizabeth, that she was someone new who needed a new identity. But she was right. They couldn't continue calling her nothing. "What name do you want?" he asked. She thought for a long moment, the pencil hovering over the paper. Finally she wrote, "Anna, it feels right somehow. Anna, not Elizabeth." The disappointment surprised him with its intensity, but he pushed it down. "Anna's a good name." "Anna Brennan," she wrote, testing it out. Then she looked up at him with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. For now, at least. The wedding was arranged for the following Sunday. Pastor Reynolds came to the cabin on Thursday to meet with them, his weathered face kind, but his questions pointed. He wanted to know how they'd met, what their intentions were, whether they understood the sanctity of marriage vows. Thomas let Anna answer most of it through her written words. She explained about the raid, about waking in the cabin with no memory, about Thomas's care and the committee's concerns. She wrote that she knew it was unconventional, but that she believed Thomas was a good man and that marriage was the right choice for both of them. The pastor seemed satisfied, though Thomas caught him looking between them with something like concern. Before he left, Reynolds pulled Thomas aside. "Son, I've known you since you came to this territory. I know what you lost when Elizabeth died. Are you certain you're doing this for the right reasons?" Thomas met his eyes steadily. "I'm doing it to help someone who needs help, and to keep the town from crucifying both of us for daring to break their rules. And if she never remembers who she was, if she's truly Anna now, not whoever she was before, then she's Anna, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Reynolds studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Sunday, then. Keep it simple. Just you, her, and the witnesses the law requires. No need to make it more complicated than it already is." The days between that conversation and Sunday passed in a strange blur. Anna grew stronger, managing longer periods on her feet, helping more around the cabin. They fell into a routine that felt almost domestic. Thomas handling the heavy outdoor work, Anna managing what indoor tasks she could, both of them navigating around each other in the small space with increasing ease. But there was an awkwardness too, an awareness of what was coming that made every interaction feel weighted. They were careful not to touch unnecessarily, maintained a respectful distance, spoke, or in Anna's case, wrote only about practical matters. At night, Thomas lay in his bedroll and listened to her breathe, wondering what he was doing, wondering if somewhere in that sleeping woman was the Elizabeth he'd loved, wondering if it mattered. One evening, 3 days before the wedding, Anna surprised him. He came in from checking the horses to find her at the stove, attempting to make dinner. She'd managed to get a pot of stew going, though the effort had clearly exhausted her. She was leaning heavily against the counter, her face pale. "You should be resting," Thomas said, moving to help her to a chair. She shook her head and pointed at the stew, then wrote, "I need to be useful. I can't just sit and be cared for forever. You're still healing. I'm healing faster because you've taken such good care of me. But I need to start carrying my own weight." Thomas looked at the stew, then at her. "You made this from memory?" She paused, then wrote, "I think so. My hands seemed to know what to do, even though my mind didn't remember deciding. Does that make sense?" It did, actually. Muscle memory surviving when conscious memory had failed. Thomas felt his heart rate pick up. "What else do you remember? Not consciously, but physically?" Anna frowned, thinking. She wrote, "I know how to cook, how to sew. I noticed you had torn shirts and thought about mending them. How to? I don't know. Normal things, but I don't remember learning them. That's good. Those are pieces of who you were. Are they? Or are they just things everyone learns?" She looked frustrated. "I don't know what's me and what's just universal." Thomas understood the frustration. How could you rebuild an identity from fragments when you didn't know which fragments were uniquely yours? They ate the stew that night. It was good, better than anything Thomas usually made for himself, and the silence between them felt less strained than usual. After dinner, Anna wrote, "Tell me about the ranch, how it works. What do you do?" So Thomas did. He explained about the cattle, about rotating pastures and managing water rights. He told her about the horses, each with their own personality. He described the rhythm of ranch life, the seasonal patterns, the daily routines, the endless cycle of work that kept everything running. Anna listened with apparent fascination, asking questions through her notes, and Thomas found himself enjoying the explanation. He'd lived alone so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to share the details of his life with someone who cared to know them. "Do you like it?" she wrote. "The ranch life?" Thomas considered the question. "It's hard, sometimes brutally hard, but it's mine. I built it with my own hands, made something real out of nothing. That matters." "You built it with Elizabeth," Anna wrote, and Thomas felt the careful way she formed the letters of his dead wife's name. "Yes, we built it together." He paused. She loved this place. Loved the freedom of it, the possibility. She used to say that out here, people could be whoever they chose to be. That the frontier didn't care about your past, only about what you could build for the future. Anna stared at what he'd said for a long moment. Then she wrote, "That's beautiful. She sounds like she was remarkable." She was. "I'm sorry I might not be her." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He looked at Anna, really looked at her, and saw not a ghost or maybe Elizabeth, but a woman sitting at his table, wearing his too large shirt, her dark hair falling around her face, her hazel eyes watching him with concern and care. "I'm sorry, too," he admitted. "But Anna, you're remarkable yourself. The way you've fought to survive, the strength it must take to face every day, not knowing who you are. That's not nothing." She looked down at her hands, and Thomas saw her shoulders shake slightly. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, the first real smile he'd seen from her. She wrote, "Thank you." I needed to hear that. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. Thomas felt something shift between them, some barrier coming down. They might be strangers forced together by circumstances, but they were becoming something else too. Friends, maybe, or something more complicated that didn't have a name yet. The night before the wedding, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin. Tomorrow he'd marry Anna. Tomorrow she'd become his wife-in-law, if not in fact. Tomorrow everything would change, or perhaps nothing would change, or perhaps something in between. Thomas. The whisper was so quiet he almost missed it. His name, spoken aloud for the first time, in a voice rough from disuse. He sat up, startled. In the bed, Anna was propped on one elbow, looking at him in the darkness. "You spoke," he said, his own voice hoarse with surprise. "I think," she whispered, then stopped, as if testing whether she could continue. "I think my voice is coming back. Not completely, but something." Thomas stood and moved closer, not wanting to miss a word. "Does it hurt to talk?" "A little. Feels strange. Like I've forgotten how." She paused. "Is this how I sounded before?" The question pierced him. Her voice was soft, slightly husky, with an uncertain quality that might have been from disuse or might have been who she was. Elizabeth's voice had been clearer, more musical. But the voices changed. Trauma changed them. Time changed them. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's a good voice, strong." "Thomas," she said again, as if practicing. "Tomorrow we marry. We do. Are you afraid?" The honest question deserved an honest answer. "Yes, are you?" Terrified, she pushed herself up to sitting, the blankets falling to her waist. "But not of you, of myself, of not knowing who I am, of never knowing." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep space between them. "You'll know eventually. Maybe not all at once, but pieces will come back. And until they do, you'll build new memories, new pieces of who you are. With you," she whispered, "with me." They sat in the darkness, two people on the edge of a decision neither had fully chosen but both were committed to making. Outside, an owl called from the cottonwood tree near the creek. Inside, the fire burned low, painting shadows on the walls. "Thomas," Anna said one more time, softer now. "Thank you for everything. For saving me, for giving me a chance to find myself again. You don't need to thank me. I do. Because you didn't have to. You could have sent me away with those women. You could have washed your hands of me." She paused. "Why didn't you?" It was the question Thomas had been asking himself. Why had he fought to keep her here? Why had he offered marriage rather than let her go? Was it because she might be Elizabeth? Or was it something else, something he wasn't ready to name? Because, he said finally. "Something told me you were supposed to be here, that this was where you needed to be. And I've learned to trust those feelings, even when I don't understand them." Anna reached out in the darkness, her hand finding his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start over. Both of us," Thomas agreed. They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped in the dark, two broken people hoping that together they might make something whole. Then Anna withdrew her hand and lay back down, and Thomas returned to his bedroll, but neither of them slept much that night. Tomorrow would bring change, irrevocable and profound. Tomorrow they would stand before God and community and speak vows that would bind them together. For better or worse, tomorrow Anna would become his wife. And somewhere beneath the fear and uncertainty, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, hope that the future might hold more than just survival, that it might hold happiness too, unexpected and hard-won, that it might hold love, if they were brave enough to reach for it. The dawn came grey and cold, and with it came the day everything would change. The wedding ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. Pastor Reynolds spoke the traditional words in his steady voice while Thomas and Anna stood before him in the small church, their hands joined. Margaret Anderson and Sarah Collins served as witnesses, their faces solemn and watchful. A handful of other townspeople had come, more from curiosity than celebration, their whispers filling the spaces between the pastor's words. Anna wore a simple grey dress that Sarah Collins had brought, altered hastily to fit her thinner frame. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of her face that were slowly filling out as she regained her strength. When she spoke her vows, her voice was barely audible, each word clearly costing her effort. But she didn't falter. Thomas heard himself repeat the promises to have and to hold for better or worse, in sickness and in health, and felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd spoken these words before to Elizabeth, in a different church, in a different life. Now he was speaking them again to a woman who might be Elizabeth or might be a stranger, and either possibility terrified him equally when Pastor Reynolds pronounced them husband and wife. Thomas lifted Anna's hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw relief mixed with something that looked like sorrow. They were married now, bound together legally and before God, but the distance between them remained vast as an ocean. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Anna sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, her body swaying with the motion, and he could feel exhaustion radiating from her. The ceremony had drained what little reserves she'd built up, and by the time they reached the cabin, she could barely stand. Thomas helped her inside and to the bed, their bed now, he supposed, though they hadn't discussed sleeping arrangements. She collapsed onto it fully clothed, her eyes already closing. "Rest," Thomas said quietly. "I'll handle everything else." She reached out and caught his sleeve, her fingers weak but insistent. "Thank you," she whispered, the words scratchy and soft. Then sleep claimed her. Thomas stood looking down at his wife, and felt the strangeness of it wash over him. They were married, but nothing had really changed. She still slept in the bed while he took the floor. They still moved around each other carefully, politely, like strangers forced to share close quarters, but something had changed too. A commitment had been made. A line had been crossed. Whatever happened now, they would face it together, bound by vows and law and necessity. The first 3 days of marriage passed in quiet awkwardness. Anna recovered slowly from the exertion of the wedding, spending most of her time resting while her voice grew stronger. They spoke little, communicating mostly through practical necessities. Thomas brought meals. Anna ate them. Thomas worked the ranch. Anna watched from the window. The routine was peaceful but hollow, like living in a house with a polite roommate rather than a wife. On the 4th day, the weather turned. Thomas woke before dawn to an unnatural stillness. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the sky had taken on a sickly yellow-grey color that made his stomach clench. He'd seen this before, the warning signs of a major storm building. In Montana territory, winter storms could come suddenly and stay for days. burying everything under feet of snow and bringing temperatures cold enough to kill. He moved quickly, checking supplies and preparing. The cattle would need to be brought closer to the barn. The horses needed extra feed. Firewood had to be stacked inside, and every gap in the cabin walls needed to be chinked against the cold. He had maybe 6 hours before the storm hit if he was lucky. Anna woke and found him hauling wood. "What's happening?" Her voice was still hoarse but clearer each day. "Storm coming. A bad one." Thomas didn't stop working. "Stay inside where it's warm. I can help. You're not strong enough yet. I'm stronger than you think." She grabbed her coat, his old coat, really, that hung loose on her frame. "Tell me what to do." Thomas wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. "Fine. Help me stack this wood inside. But if you start feeling weak, you stop immediately." "Understood." She nodded and set to work. They moved in synchronization, Thomas cutting and hauling while Anna stacked, building up a supply that would last them through several days if necessary. She moved slowly but steadily, and Thomas found himself impressed by her determination, even as he worried about her pushing too hard. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By 2 o'clock, the wind had picked up, driving the snow sideways. Thomas worked frantically to secure the barn, reinforce the fences, and move the cattle to sheltered ground. Anna helped where she could, but Thomas could see her flagging, her movements growing sluggish. "Inside," he ordered when he found her leaning heavily against the barn wall, breathing hard. Now, for once, she didn't argue. She stumbled toward the cabin, and Thomas watched to make sure she made it before turning back to his work. The storm was intensifying faster than he'd anticipated. He needed to get the last of the horses secured and check the cattle one more time. It was nearly dark when he finally made it back to the cabin. The wind was howling now, visibility reduced to almost nothing. Snow had accumulated in drifts against the cabin walls, and ice was forming on everything. Thomas fought his way to the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut against the storm's fury. Anna was at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She turned as he entered, and her face went pale. "You're bleeding." Thomas looked down and saw blood on his hands, his coat. A fence post had caught him across the arm when the wind tore it loose, but he'd been too focused on the work to notice. Now that she'd pointed it out, he felt the sting of it. "It's nothing," he said. But Anna was already moving toward him with a cloth and water. "Sit," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Too tired to protest, Thomas sat and let her clean the wound. It was deeper than he'd thought, but not serious. Her hands were gentle but competent as she wrapped it with strips torn from an old shirt, and Thomas found himself watching her face as she worked. The concentration, the care, the capable way she handled the injury, all of it reminded him achingly of Elizabeth. "There," Anna said, tying off the bandage. "Try not to tear it open again." "I'll do my best." Thomas flexed his arm, testing the wrapping. "Thank you." They ate the stew she'd made while the storm raged outside. The cabin walls shook with each gust of wind, and snow found its way through cracks they'd missed, dusting the floor near the windows. Thomas knew it was going to be a long night. "How long will it last?" Anna asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Could be a day. Could be 3. Thomas added another log to the fire. "We've got enough supplies. We'll be fine." But even as he said it, he felt uneasy. Something about this storm felt wrong, more violent than usual. And he still had cattle out there, horses in a barn that was older than it should be. If something went wrong, the thought was interrupted by a tremendous crack of wood splintering. Thomas was on his feet instantly, grabbing his coat. "The barn. You can't go out there," Anna protested. "You'll die in this!" "The horses will die if I don't. That was the barn door. I know that sound." Thomas was already wrapping a rope around his waist, the other end tied securely to the main support beam of the cabin. It was an old ranch trick. If he got disoriented in the storm, he could follow the rope back. "I'll be quick." "Thomas, please," but he was already out the door, immediately swallowed by the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The wind drove snow into his face so hard it felt like needles. Visibility was zero. He couldn't see his own hands in front of him. He followed the rope, counting steps, using memory to guide him toward where the barn should be. The wind tried to tear him off his feet. Ice formed instantly on his beard, his eyelashes. His injured arm screamed protest, but he pushed forward. The barn loomed out of the white suddenly, and Thomas saw his fear confirmed. The main door had been torn partially off its hinges, hanging at a crazy angle and banging against the frame with each gust. Inside, he could hear the horses screaming in panic. Thomas fought his way inside and assessed the damage. 3 horses were still secured in their stalls, wild-eyed and terrified, but safe. But Sage, his best mare, had broken free and was trying to bolt out the broken door into the storm. If she made it outside, she'd be dead within an hour. Moving on instinct, Thomas grabbed a rope and moved slowly toward the panicked animal. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice lost in the wind. "Easy now." Sage reared, her hooves barely missing his head. Thomas dodged and tried again, speaking in low tones, moving carefully. On his 3rd attempt, he managed to get the rope around her neck and secured her to a post. She fought him every step, but finally exhausted, she settled into trembling stillness. Thomas turned his attention to the door. It was damaged beyond quick repair, but he could at least secure it enough to keep the worst of the storm out. He worked frantically, his hands so cold he could barely feel them, using whatever materials he could find to brace the door. He didn't know how long he was out there. Time lost meaning in the chaos of wind and snow and frantic work. But eventually, the door was secured enough. The horses were calm, and Thomas knew he needed to get back before hypothermia set in. He stumbled out of the barn and reached for the rope, but his numb fingers found only his belt. The rope was gone. The knot had come loose, or the ice had made it slip, or it didn't matter. It was gone. Thomas stood in the blizzard and felt the first real stab of fear. Without the rope, he had no way to navigate back to the cabin. He could be 10 feet from his front door, or 100 yards away. One wrong step and he'd wander until he collapsed in the snow. He tried to think clearly through the cold and panic. The cabin was south of the barn. The wind was coming from the northwest. If he angled himself against the wind and walked straight, he should hit the cabin, or at least get close enough to see it. Thomas started walking. Every step was agony. His feet were numb, his hands useless frozen clubs. The injured arm had stopped hurting, which was worse than if it had still hurt. He couldn't feel his face anymore. He had no idea how far he'd gone when he heard it, a sound cutting through the storm. A voice calling his name, "Thomas, Thomas." She was outside in the storm calling for him. Terror gave him new strength. If she was out here, she was as lost as he was. He tried to call back but couldn't draw enough breath. He stumbled toward where he thought the voice had come from. "Thomas! Follow my voice!" He did, using every ounce of will he had left to keep moving toward that sound. And then suddenly there was light, dim, flickering, but there. A lantern held high by a figure barely visible through the snow. Anna. She tied a rope around herself, secured to the cabin, and come out into the storm with a lantern to guide him home. Thomas staggered the last few steps, and she grabbed him, her arm surprisingly strong around his waist. "I've got you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. "Follow me. Just a few more steps." Together they stumbled through the snow, Anna guiding them both along the rope back to the cabin. Thomas's legs gave out as they reached the door, and Anna had to half-drag him inside before collapsing beside him, both of them breathing hard, covered in ice and snow. For a long moment, neither could speak. Then Thomas managed, "You shouldn't have come out there and let you die." Anna's voice was sharp with anger and fear. "You were gone too long. I knew something was wrong. You could have died too, but I didn't. We didn't." She pushed herself up and started pulling off his frozen coat with shaking hands. "You're freezing. We need to warm you up before frostbite sets in." She worked quickly, stripping off his wet outer clothes and wrapping him in blankets, building up the fire until it roared. Thomas's body started to shake uncontrollably as sensation returned, bringing with it waves of pain. Anna stayed beside him, rubbing his hands and feet, talking to him constantly. "Stay with me, Thomas. You're going to be fine. Just breathe. Keep breathing." Hours passed. Slowly, agonizingly, warmth returned to Thomas's body. Anna never left his side, feeding the fire, checking his extremities for frostbite, forcing hot broth down his throat. When he finally stopped shaking, she collapsed into the chair beside where he lay, wrapped in blankets on the floor. "You saved my life," Thomas said, his voice rough. "You saved mine first." Anna looked exhausted, her face drawn, but her eyes were fierce. "That's what marriage means, doesn't it? Saving each other." Thomas stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a ghost of Elizabeth, not as a stranger he'd taken in out of obligation, but as Anna, his wife who'd risked her own barely recovered life to save his. "I shouldn't have let you help today," he said. "You pushed yourself too hard. You're exhausted." "I'm tired of being weak," her voice cracked. "I'm tired of being the one who needs saving. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to matter. You do matter. You've always mattered, have I? Or have I just been a burden? An obligation you took on because you're too decent to turn someone away?" The words poured out of her now, months of fear and frustration finally breaking free. "I don't know who I am, Thomas. I don't know if I'm your dead wife or a complete stranger. I don't know my real name or where I came from, or if anyone out there is missing me. All I know is that I'm here, in your home, sleeping in your bed, bearing your name, and I don't know if you even want me here or if you're just—" "Stop," Thomas interrupted, sitting up despite the pain. "Stop right there." Anna fell silent, tears streaming down her face. Thomas reached out and took her cold hands in his still warming ones. "Listen to me. I don't care if you're Elizabeth or Anna or someone else entirely. What I care about is the woman who stayed up 3 nights in a row when I had a fever last week, who learned to cook my terrible coffee the way I like it, who just risked her life in a blizzard to save mine. That's who matters. That's who I want here. But what if I'm not her? What if I never remember? Then you're Anna Brennan, my wife, and that's enough. That's more than enough." She looked at him with those hazel eyes, searching for truth. "You mean that?" "I mean that." Something broke between them then, some final wall that had been keeping them apart. Anna leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, and Thomas felt her tears on his skin. "I was so scared," she whispered, "when you didn't come back. I was terrified." "I know, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just don't die. Promise me you won't die." Thomas knew it was a promise he couldn't really make, but he made it anyway. "I promise." They stayed like that, foreheads touching, hands clasped, while the storm raged outside. Two people who'd been strangers weeks ago, bound now by more than vows or necessity, bound by choice and sacrifice, and the fierce determination to survive together. Eventually, Anna pulled back. "You need to rest, real rest." "In the bed. I'm fine on the floor. Thomas Brennan, you nearly died tonight." "You're sleeping in the bed." "I'll take the floor." "Absolutely not." "You're barely recovered yourself." They stared at each other, both stubborn, both exhausted. Then Anna said quietly, "The bed is big enough for 2. If we both stay on our own sides." It was a practical solution to an impractical argument. Thomas knew he should refuse, knew it crossed a line they'd been carefully maintaining. But he was too tired and too cold, and too shaken by how close he'd come to dying. "All right," he agreed. "But you take the inside. Farther from the drafts." They settled into the bed, with careful distance between them, both fully clothed, blankets piled high against the cold. The cabin creaked and groaned under the storm's assault, but inside it was warm and safe. Thomas lay in the darkness, acutely aware of Anna beside him. Her breathing gradually slowed and deepened as sleep claimed her, but he stayed awake, thinking about everything that had happened, about how she'd come out into the storm for him, about how he'd felt when he thought he might never make it back, about how the woman beside him had become more important to him than he'd realized. Somewhere in the night, Anna shifted in her sleep, and her hand found his under the blankets. Her fingers curled around his palm, holding on even in unconsciousness. Thomas didn't pull away. Instead, he held on too, anchor and anchored, two people weathering the storm together. Outside, the blizzard howled its fury at the world. Inside, two hearts beat in the darkness, learning the rhythm of each other, and in that moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty, whatever the truth about who Anna had been before, whoever she turned out to be, he wanted her in his life, not as a replacement for Elizabeth, but as herself, as Anna, as his wife. The storm would pass eventually. The sun would rise on a world transformed by snow, and they would wake to face it together, changed by the night's trials into something neither had been before, something stronger, something real. The test had come, and they had survived it. But more than that, they'd chosen each other in the midst of it. And that choice, made in crisis and sealed with trust, would change everything that came after. The worst was behind them now, or so they thought. The storm lasted 2 more days, keeping them trapped inside while snow piled against the walls and the temperature dropped to brutal lows. But inside the cabin, something had fundamentally shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved, replaced by an easy intimacy born from crisis and survived together. They moved around each other now with unconscious coordination, passing tools and dishes without needing to ask, anticipating each other's needs. Thomas taught Anna how to maintain the rifles, showing her how to clean and load them in case of emergency. She taught him a way of braiding leather strips that her hands remembered even if her mind didn't. And together they repaired worn tack while wind howled outside. At night they shared the bed without discussion or awkwardness. They stayed on their respective sides, but the distance between them grew smaller each evening. Sometimes Thomas would wake to find Anna's hand resting on his arm. Sometimes she'd wake to find his shoulder pressed against hers. Neither pulled away. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. Thomas woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the window and a silence so profound it was almost eerie. Beside him, Anna stirred and opened her eyes. "It's over," she whispered, her voice still rough with sleep. "It's over," Thomas agreed. They rose and dressed, maintaining the habit of turning away while the other changed, the last vestige of propriety in their increasingly improper arrangement. When Thomas opened the cabin door, the world had been transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep in places, sculpted into fantastic drifts by the wind. The sky was painfully blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. "It's beautiful," Anna said, standing beside him in the doorway. It was, and terrible. Thomas could see several cattle motionless in the distance, frozen where they'd stood, unable to find shelter. Others were bunched in the lee of rocks and trees, still alive, but barely. The work ahead would be brutal. "I need to check on everything," Thomas said. "The animals, the damage. It's going to take days to dig out. I'll help." "Anna, don't." She cut him off with a look. "We're past that now. Tell me what to do." So he did. They worked together through that day and the next, digging paths to the barn, breaking ice from water troughs, checking each animal for frostbite or injury. Anna tired quickly, but pushed through it, her determination outweighing her still recovering strength. Thomas watched her shovel snow with fierce concentration, her breath coming in clouds, and felt something warm settle in his chest. Pride, he realized. He was proud of her. Of her toughness, her refusal to quit, her willingness to do hard work without complaint. On the 4th day after the storm, Thomas rode out to check the far pasture and found Jacob Anderson doing the same on his land. They met at the property line, both looking haggard from days of storm recovery. "Lost 6 head, Anderson said grimly. "You? 4. Could have been worse." Anderson nodded, then studied Thomas with assessing eyes. "How's your wife handling ranch life?" The question was casual, but Thomas heard the real inquiry beneath it. How was the strange marriage working out? Was the woman with no memory adapting? Had the town right to worry? "She's stronger than anyone gave her credit for," Thomas said. "She's been working alongside me since the storm cleared. Margaret will be glad to hear it. She's been worried, thought maybe the woman was too fragile for frontier life." Anderson paused. "Between you and me, I think Margaret feels guilty about pushing you two into marriage so fast. She's been fretting that she forced your hand." Thomas considered that. Had they been forced? Technically, yes. But looking back now, he couldn't quite regret it. Sometimes things work out the way they're meant to, even when they start wrong, Anderson smiled. That's the truth of it. My own marriage started rough. Margaret's father disapproved of me. But we've had 30 good years. He gathered his reins. You two should come for dinner once things settle. Margaret's curious about your Anna, and I think she'd like to make amends for being so heavy-handed. After Anderson left, Thomas sat on his horse looking out over the snow-covered land. Your Anna, Anderson had said. Not the woman or your wife, but Anna, as if she'd always existed, as if there'd never been any question about who she was. Maybe there hadn't been. Maybe she'd been Anna all along, and everything else, his suspicions, his hope that she might be Elizabeth, had been him trying to resurrect the past instead of embracing the present. That evening, Thomas came in to find Anna kneeling by the hearth, staring into the fire with an odd expression on her face. Her hands were pressed to her temples and she looked pale. "What's wrong?" he asked, crossing to her quickly. "I remembered something." Her voice shook. "Actually remembered, not just my hands knowing how to do things." An actual memory. Thomas knelt beside her. "What did you remember?" "Fire." She closed her eyes. "But not the wagon fire. A different one. I was younger. There was a cabin, small, cramped. And fire, so much fire. I was trying to get out, but there was smoke and I couldn't breathe. Someone was calling my name, but I can't remember what name they called." She opened her eyes, and they were wet with tears. "That's all. Just fragments. But it felt real." Thomas felt his heart hammering. A cabin fire. Elizabeth had died in a cabin fire, or that's what he'd been told. What if the body the midwife had been so certain was Elizabeth's had actually been someone else's? What if in the chaos and grief they'd been wrong? But he couldn't say that to Anna. Couldn't plant that hope or fear until he knew more. "More will come," he said instead. "Your mind is starting to unlock. That's good, is it?" "I'm not sure I want to remember." She wrapped her arms around herself. "What if my past is worse than not knowing?" Thomas wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. So he simply sat beside her, their shoulders touching, and let her lean against him, while the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls. The next week brought more memories, each one fragmentary and confusing. Anna would be doing some ordinary task and suddenly freeze, her eyes going distant. Once it was while washing dishes. She remembered water, cold water, and someone teaching her to swim. Another time while mending clothes, a woman's voice, patient and kind, showing her how to make small, even stitches. "I think I had a mother," she said one evening, her voice wondering. "Or maybe a sister. Someone who cared about me, who taught me things." "Most people do," Thomas said gently. "But who were they? Where are they?" The frustration in her voice was palpable. "Why can't I remember faces? Why just these useless fragments?" Thomas had no answer. Doc Halstead had warned that memory might return this way, in pieces out of order, impossible to assemble into a coherent whole. It was maddening for Anna, he knew, like having a puzzle with half the pieces missing. One afternoon, Thomas was sorting through supplies in the back room when he came across an old trunk he hadn't opened in years. Elizabeth's trunk, packed away after her death because he couldn't bear to look at it. Now, moved by impulse he didn't fully understand, he opened it. Her clothes were still inside, carefully folded, her brush still holding strands of auburn hair, a small jewelry box with the few pieces she'd owned, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, her Bible with her maiden name inscribed inside, Elizabeth Sarah Mitchell. Thomas sat back on his heels, holding the Bible, and felt grief wash over him fresh as the day she died. He'd loved her so much, had built a life with her, buried her, mourned her, and now here he was, married to another woman, wondering if she might somehow be the same person. It was madness. It had to be, Thomas. He turned to find Anna in the doorway, looking at him with concern. "I found Elizabeth's things," he said, gesturing at the trunk. Anna moved closer, kneeling beside him. She looked at the trunk's contents with careful attention, as if searching for something she couldn't name. Then she reached out and touched the brush, running her fingers over the handle. "May I?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Anna picked up the brush and examined it. Then slowly she drew it through her own dark hair. The gesture was unconscious, automatic, the way someone might use a familiar object. Thomas watched, his breath caught in his throat. Elizabeth had always brushed her hair exactly that way, starting at the ends and working up, using that same gentle, practiced motion. "This is a good brush," Anna said absently, still brushing. "Well made. The bristles are—" She stopped suddenly, her hand freezing mid-stroke. "I've used this before. I know I have. How do you know?" "I don't know how I know. But my hand knows it. The weight of it, the feel." She looked at him, eyes wide. "Thomas, why would I know this brush?" He couldn't answer. His mind was racing, fitting pieces together that couldn't possibly fit. A cabin fire that Anna remembered. Elizabeth dying in a cabin fire. Anna knowing Elizabeth's brush. The resemblance he'd noticed from the beginning. Could it be a coincidence? Anna whispered. "Could I just happen to have used a similar brush?" Maybe, but they both knew it wasn't maybe. The truth was pressing in on them, impossible and inevitable. Anna set the brush down carefully and reached for the Bible. She opened it to the front page and stared at the name written there in fading ink. "Elizabeth Sarah Mitchell," she read aloud. Who was she, Thomas, really? So Thomas told her everything. Not the abbreviated version he'd shared before, but all of it. How they'd met, how they'd courted, how she'd defied her father to marry him, how they'd traveled west full of dreams, how she'd worked beside him building the ranch, never complaining, always seeing the potential in everything. How she'd gotten pregnant and how happy they'd been. He told her about the difficult birth, about the baby who never breathed, about Elizabeth's fever and delirium, about the midwife who'd been so certain Elizabeth was dying that she'd told him to prepare for the worst, about the fire that had broken out in the cabin where Elizabeth lay unconscious, a lantern tipped over in the chaos, they'd said. He told her how he'd been outside tending the animals when it happened, how he'd seen the flames and run, but the fire had been too fast, too hot, how they'd pulled a body from the wreckage, burned beyond recognition, how the midwife had identified it as Elizabeth based on the wedding ring and the location where she'd been lying. "I buried her," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I stood over her grave and said goodbye. How could that not be her? How could they have been wrong?" Anna sat very still, her face pale. But what if they were? What if in all that confusion and smoke and death they made a mistake? What if the body was someone else, the midwife maybe, or someone else who'd been there? "Then where were you for 3 years? How did you end up with a wagon train? Why don't you remember any of this?" "I don't know." Anna pressed her hands to her head, as if trying to force the memories out. "I don't know, but Thomas, that fire I remembered. What if it was the same fire? What if I did almost die, and somehow I survived, but the trauma made me forget everything?" Thomas wanted to believe it. God, how he wanted to believe it. But the logical part of his mind kept raising objections. "Your hair," he said. "Elizabeth's hair was auburn. Yours is dark brown. Hair darkens with age. With trauma, I've read about it. You're thinner than she was. Your voice is different. 3 years of God knows what would make anyone thinner. And voices change." But even as she argued, doubt crept into her expression. They sat in silence, surrounded by Elizabeth's belongings, caught between impossible hope and crushing uncertainty. Finally, Anna said, "There's one way we might know for sure." "How?" "Elizabeth had a scar. You told me about the baby, about the difficult birth. There would have been a scar from that." "Do I have it?" Thomas's breath caught. He hadn't thought of that. After the birth, Elizabeth had had a long scar low on her abdomen from where the midwife had cut to try to save the baby. It would have healed, but never disappeared entirely. "I don't know," he said. We've never... "I know." Anna's face flushed. "But if I do have that scar, in that exact place, would that be proof? It would be strong evidence." "But Anna, are you sure you want to know? If you're not her, if I'm not her, then I'm not. But I need to know. We both do." She stood, her hands going to the buttons of her shirt. "Turn around," Thomas did, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He heard the rustle of fabric, heard Anna's breathing quicken with nervousness or fear or both. "Thomas," she said after a moment, her voice strange, "there's a scar. low on my abdomen, maybe 6 inches long. Healed, but still visible. Thomas closed his eyes. That's where Elizabeth's scar was. Then Anna's voice broke. Then I might be her. I might actually be Elizabeth. Slowly, Thomas turned around. Anna had refastened her shirt, but her face was white with shock. They stared at each other across the small room, the weight of revelation pressing down on both of them. I don't remember being her, Anna whispered. I don't remember you or this place or our life together. How can I be someone I don't remember being? Thomas crossed to her and took her hands. They were shaking. Maybe you are Elizabeth. Maybe you're not, and the scar is coincidence. But here's what I know for certain. You're Anna. You're the woman who saved my life in a blizzard, who's worked beside me to keep this ranch running, who's brave and stubborn and kind. That's who you are right now, and that's who I... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Who you what? She prompted softly. Who I care about, Thomas finished. Not because you might be Elizabeth, but because you're you. Anna looked up at him with those hazel eyes, and in them Thomas saw confusion and fear, and something else, something warm that made his heart race. I care about you too, she said. But Thomas, if I am Elizabeth, if I'm your wife who you thought was dead, doesn't that change everything? Does it? You don't remember being her. I've spent 3 years learning to live without her. We're different people now than we were then, but if I remember, if all those memories come back, then we'll deal with it, together. Thomas squeezed her hands. Whatever the truth is, we face it together. Anna nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried. For lost memories or found ones, for the past or the present, he wasn't sure. Maybe for all of it, as he held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beat against his chest. Thomas realized something that should have terrified him, but somehow didn't. He was falling in love with her, not with the ghost of Elizabeth, not with the possibility of who she might have been, but with Anna, with exactly who she was right now, and whether she turned out to be Elizabeth returned from the dead, or a stranger who'd stumbled into his life. That feeling wasn't going to change. We'll figure it out, he murmured into her hair. Whatever the truth is, we'll figure it out together. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her face wet with tears, but her expression determined. Promise? Promise. And there, in the small back room, surrounded by the remnants of a past that might or might not belong to the woman in his arms, Thomas Brennan made a choice. He chose the present over the past. He chose Anna over Elizabeth. He chose the woman he'd come to know over the memory of the woman he'd lost. And as if sensing his decision, Anna rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. Tentative, uncertain but real. Thomas kissed her back, gentle and careful, tasting salt from her tears and something sweeter beneath. It was nothing like kissing Elizabeth had been. It was its own thing entirely. It was perfect. When they pulled apart, Anna whispered, Whatever I was before, I'm yours now. If you'll have me, I'll have you, Thomas said. Today, tomorrow, always. Outside, the sun was setting over snow-covered fields, painting the world in shades of gold and pink. Inside, 2 people held each other in the gathering darkness. Bound by more than memory or mystery, bound by choice, by trust, by love that was just beginning to bloom. The truth about Anna's identity might never fully reveal itself, but perhaps it didn't matter anymore. Perhaps what mattered was only this: 2 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of tragedy, who'd built something real from ruins and loss. That was truth enough. That was everything. Spring came early to Montana that year, arriving in March with warm winds that melted the snow and turned the prairie into a sea of mud. The creek swelled with runoff, and the first wildflowers pushed through the softening earth, yellow glacier lilies and purple shooting stars dotting the hillsides. The world was waking up, and with it came a sense of possibility that hadn't existed in the depths of winter. Thomas stood on the porch he'd been repairing, watching Anna work in the garden plot she'd insisted on expanding. She moved with confidence now, no trace of the weakness that had plagued her through the winter. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a practical braid, and her skin had taken on colour from hours spent outdoors. She wore one of Elizabeth's old dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame, and as she worked, she hummed, a tuneless melody that she'd started producing unconsciously a few weeks back. She looked happy. More than that, she looked at home. 4 months had passed since the night they'd kissed in the back room, since they'd made their choice to move forward regardless of the past's mysteries. Those months had transformed them both in ways Thomas was still discovering. The careful distance that had marked their early marriage had dissolved entirely. They touched freely now, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing dishes, the casual intimacy of people who'd learned to read each other's moods and needs. At night, they slept curled together, Anna's back pressed against Thomas's chest, his arm draped over her waist. It had happened gradually, neither of them quite sure when the last barriers had fallen, but now it felt as natural as breathing. She was his wife in every sense, and he was her husband. And the question of whether she'd been someone else before had faded into background noise, though it never quite disappeared. More memories had surfaced as winter gave way to spring. Anna would be doing something ordinary and suddenly freeze, her eyes going distant as fragments of the past pushed through. She'd remembered a journey west, though the details were hazy. A wagon, endless prairie, fear and excitement mixed together. She'd remembered loving someone, though she couldn't see his face. She'd remembered loss so profound it had taken her breath away. Each memory she shared with Thomas, and together they tried to piece them into something coherent. But it was like assembling a puzzle in the dark, feeling the edges of pieces, without being able to see the full picture. She might be remembering Elizabeth's life, Doc Halstead had said during his last visit. Or she might be remembering her own life, and the parallels are coincidental. Or she might be combining memories with things you've told her, creating false recollections that feel real. The mind is a strange thing, especially after trauma. Thomas had nodded, but privately he thought the doctor was wrong. The memories weren't false. They were too specific, too emotionally charged. Anna was remembering something real. The question was whether that something was Elizabeth's life or someone else's entirely. But as spring deepened and their days filled with the work of maintaining the ranch, the question mattered less and less. Anna was here. She was real. She was his. That was what counted. "Thomas!" Anna called from the garden, waving him over. "Look at this." He climbed down from the porch and crossed the muddy yard. Anna was kneeling beside a patch of freshly turned earth, her hands dirty and her face alight with excitement. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "This soil, it's perfect for tomatoes. And I was thinking, over there," she pointed to a sunnier spot, "we could put in squash, and maybe some corn along the fence line, where it won't shade anything else." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "We could have a real garden, Thomas. Enough to can for winter, enough to maybe sell some in town." Thomas crouched beside her, studying the plot with her same enthusiasm. "You've got it all planned out. I've been thinking about it all winter, imagining how it could be." She paused, her expression turning uncertain. "Is that all right? I know this is your ranch, your land. I don't want to overstep." "It's our ranch," Thomas corrected gently. "Our land. And yes, a bigger garden is a fine idea. We'll need to build some cold frames for starting seeds, and we should order supplies from town." He stopped because Anna had thrown her arms around his neck, kissing him with muddy hands and dirt-streaked face, her joy infectious. Thomas kissed her back, tasting earth and sunshine, feeling her laughter against his lips. "Thank you," she said when they pulled apart, "for letting me build something here, for giving me a purpose. You don't need to thank me. You've given me just as much, more actually." She'd given him back his life, shown him that existence could be more than just surviving from one day to the next. They worked together through the afternoon, laying out the garden, planning what to plant where. Anna's knowledge of growing things seemed instinctive. She knew about companion planting, about soil drainage, about which vegetables needed more sun. Whether she'd learned it as Elizabeth or in some other life, the knowledge was there, and it was practical and useful. as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden plot. Anna sat back on her heels and surveyed their work with satisfaction. "It's going to be beautiful," she said. Thomas looked at her instead of the garden. "It already is." She met his eyes and smiled, that real, full smile that still had the power to make his heart race. Then she stood, brushing dirt from her dress. "I should start dinner." "Are you hungry?" "Starving." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, comfortable in their silence. Inside, Anna moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, while Thomas cleaned up. The cabin itself had changed over the winter. Small touches that Anna had added made it feel more like a home and less like a bachelor's shelter. Curtains at the windows, a tablecloth, wildflowers in a jar, books arranged on the shelf by the bed. Books had been one of Anna's rediscoveries. She'd found she could read effortlessly, and she'd devoured every book Thomas owned, plus several borrowed from the Andersons during their monthly dinners. Margaret Anderson had warmed to Anna quickly, impressed by her intelligence and work ethic, and the two women had developed an unlikely friendship. "Margaret asked if we'd come for dinner next Sunday," Anna said, as she stirred something on the stove. "She's inviting the Pritchards and the Collins family too. A spring celebration, she called it." Thomas considered that. A year ago, he would have refused immediately. Social gatherings had been torture, full of pitying looks and careful avoidance of anything that might remind him of his loss. But things were different now. "If you want to go, we'll go," he said. Anna turned to look at him. "Do you want to go?" "I want you to have friends, a life outside this ranch. So yes, I want to go." She crossed to him and cupped his face in her hands. "You're a good man, Thomas Brennan. I don't tell you that enough. You tell me plenty, not nearly enough." She kissed him softly, then returned to her cooking, leaving Thomas standing in the middle of their cabin, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. That night, lying in bed with Anna asleep beside him, Thomas found his mind drifting to Elizabeth, not with the sharp grief that had characterized the first years after her death, but with a gentle melancholy. He'd loved her deeply. Part of him would always love her. But that love had become something different now, a cherished memory rather than an open wound, and the woman sleeping in his arms, whether she was Elizabeth returned or Anna entire. He loved her too, loved her fiercely and protectively, and with a depth that sometimes scared him. She'd become essential to his existence, in ways he was still discovering. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas was working in the barn when he heard a horse approach. He stepped outside to find Doc Halstead dismounting, his expression serious. "Doc," Thomas greeted him. "Everything all right? I need to speak with you." "And Anna, is she inside?" Something in the doctor's tone made Thomas's stomach tighten. "What's this about?" "Let's all sit down first." They gathered around the table, Anna looking worried, Thomas tense with anticipation. Halstead pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and laid it on the table. "I received a telegram yesterday from a doctor in Fort Benton," he began. "He was inquiring about a woman who went missing 3 years ago after a fire. A woman named Sarah Catherine Walsh. She'd been staying at the fort with her husband, who was stationed there as a civilian contractor. There was a fire in their quarters, a tragedy. The husband died, and Sarah was presumed dead as well. But they never found her body." Anna had gone very still. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because the description matches you. Dark hair, hazel eyes, slight build, approximately 25 years old at the time, and the doctor mentioned one other detail. Sarah had a prominent scar on her abdomen from a surgical procedure a year before the fire." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him, everything he'd thought he understood suddenly thrown into question. "You think I'm Sarah Walsh," Anna said flatly. "I think it's possible. The timeline fits. The location fits. Fort Benton is about 40 miles from where you were found with that wagon train. If you survived the fire but lost your memory, you could have wandered for days before someone found you. Perhaps you ended up in a settlement, took up with a wagon train heading west, and then the raiders came," Thomas finished. And she lost her memory a second time. Halstead nodded. It's speculation, but it fits the facts we have. Anna looked down at her hands. Sarah Catherine Walsh. Is that who I am? I don't know. But her sister has been searching for her all this time. She's offered a substantial reward for information. She's desperate to know what happened to Sarah. What should I do? Anna's voice was small, uncertain. Thomas reached for her hand. That's up to you. The sister, Martha Walsh, she's in Fort Benton, Halstead continued. If you're willing to meet with her, we could arrange it. She might recognize you, or you might recognize her. It could answer your questions. Anna looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with fear and hope and confusion. What if I am her? What if I'm Sarah, not Elizabeth? What if I have a whole other life I don't remember? Then we deal with it, Thomas said firmly. Together, just like we've dealt with everything else. But what if Martha is my sister? What if I have a family who's been searching for me? Don't I owe it to them to find out? Yes, Thomas admitted, though the word felt like swallowing glass. You do. 3 days later they rode to Fort Benton. The journey took most of a day, and Anna grew increasingly nervous as they travelled. Thomas kept one hand on hers the entire way, offering what comfort he could. Martha Walsh was waiting at the fort's main building. She was a woman in her 30s with dark hair and sharp features, dressed in a travelling suit that spoke of means. When she saw Anna, she gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. "Sarah?" she whispered. "Is that really you?" Anna stood frozen, staring at the woman. "I don't know, I don't remember." Martha moved closer, her eyes searching Anna's face desperately. "It's me, Martha, your sister. Don't you remember anything? The boarding school where we grew up? The time we snuck out to see the circus? When you married Jacob, and I was so angry because I thought he wasn't good enough for you." Anna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, I don't remember any of that." Martha pulled out a photograph, her hands shaking. "Look, this is us, 3 years ago. This is you, Sarah." Anna took the photograph and stared at it. Thomas looked over her shoulder and felt his heart sink. The woman in the photograph looked remarkably like Anna, the same build, the same coloring. She was standing next to Martha, both of them smiling at the camera. "That could be me," Anna whispered. "It looks like me, but I don't remember this moment. I don't remember her." She looked at Martha with anguish. "I'm so sorry. I want to remember. I want to give you your sister back, but I don't know if I'm her." Martha's face crumpled. "The fire. It was so terrible. We thought you died with Jacob. We buried an empty coffin because we never found your remains. But I've been searching, hoping, praying that somehow you survived." She reached out tentatively. "May I?" Anna nodded, and Martha pulled her into an embrace. Over Anna's shoulder, Martha looked at Thomas with gratitude and pain mixed together. "Thank you," she said to him, "for taking care of her, for keeping her safe." The meeting lasted hours. Martha told stories about Sarah's life, about their childhood in Philadelphia, about Sarah's marriage to Jacob Walsh, about the fire that had taken everything from her. She showed more photographs, told anecdotes, tried desperately to spark recognition. Anna listened to all of it with an expression that broke Thomas's heart. She wanted to remember. He could see it in every line of her body. But the memories wouldn't come. Finally, as evening approached, Martha said quietly, "I can't force you to be someone you don't remember being. But Sarah, or Anna, if that's who you are now, you have family. You have a home in Philadelphia. Your grandparents left you an inheritance. There's money, property. You could come back with me, start over properly." Anna looked at Thomas, and in that look he saw everything, love and loyalty, and the terrible weight of choice. "I need to think," Anna said. "Can you give me time?" Martha nodded. "I'm staying at the hotel. Take as long as you need." The ride back to the ranch was silent. Thomas didn't know what to say, didn't want to influence her decision, even though everything in him screamed to beg her to stay. That night they lay in bed without touching, both staring at the ceiling in the darkness. "Tell me what to do," Anna finally said. "I can't. This has to be your choice. But what do you want?" Thomas took a shaky breath. "I want you to stay. I want you to be Anna Brennan, my wife, the woman who plants gardens and laughs at my terrible jokes and saves my life in snowstorms. But Anna, if you're Sarah Walsh, if you have family and inheritance and a whole other life waiting for you, I can't ask you to give that up for a ranch in the middle of nowhere." "It's not nowhere. It's home." She rolled to face him. "Thomas, I don't know if I'm Elizabeth who forgot who she was, or Sarah who lost everything, or someone else entirely. But I know who I am right now. I'm Anna Brennan. I'm your wife. I'm the woman who's building a garden and a life on this ranch. That's who I choose to be. What about Martha, your family? I'll write to her. I'll tell her I'm alive and safe, and if she wants to visit, she's welcome. But my life is here, with you." She cupped his face in her hands. "You taught me that the past doesn't define us, that we can choose who we want to be. So I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us." Thomas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, feeling tears he didn't try to hide. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They held each other in the darkness, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd built something real from mystery and loss and determination. The next morning, Anna wrote a letter to Martha explaining her decision. She promised to stay in touch, to share news of her life, to be grateful for knowing she had family somewhere. But she made it clear her place was here, on this ranch with Thomas. A week later, they received a reply. Martha understood, though she was disappointed. She'd enclosed documents proving Sarah's inheritance and instructions for how to claim it if Anna ever changed her mind. But more importantly, she'd written, "I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you're safe." That's all any sister could hope for. Spring turned to summer and the garden flourished. Anna's tomatoes grew heavy on their vines and the corn reached for the sky. They hired help for the summer roundup, and Thomas found himself teaching Anna how to ride properly, how to work, and cattle, how to do all the things a rancher's wife needed to know. She took to it naturally, as if she'd been born to this life, or perhaps as if she'd lived it before. Thomas still didn't know, and he'd stopped trying to figure it out. One evening in late July, they sat on the new porch Thomas had finished building, watching the sun set over the mountains. Anna's head rested on his shoulder, and his arm was around her waist. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "who I really was?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "Do you?" "All the time. But then I think, does it matter? That person is gone. Whoever. I was before the fire, before the raiders, before I woke up in your cabin. She's lost. I'm who I am now, and I like who I am now." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I like who you are now, too." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The ranch spread out before them. Their ranch, built together, maintained together, dreamed about together. "Thomas," Anna said eventually, "I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to make a big fuss about it." "All right, I'm pregnant." For a moment, the words didn't register. Then Thomas sat up straight, looking at her with shock and joy and terror all mixed together. Are you sure?" Doc Halstead confirmed it yesterday when he stopped by, about 2 months along. Thomas's mind raced. A baby. They were going to have a baby. After everything they'd been through, after all the uncertainty and mystery and pain, a baby. "Are you happy?" Anna asked, watching his face carefully. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." Thomas pulled her close, mindful now of the life growing inside her. Terrified and ecstatic and grateful and... He couldn't find more words. Anna laughed, the sound rich and full. "That's about how I feel too. They sat together as full darkness fell, Thomas's hand resting protectively over Anna's still flat stomach. A new life, a new beginning, the future stretching out before them, full of possibility and hope. Whether Anna was Elizabeth returned, or Sarah Walsh, or someone else entirely didn't matter anymore. She was Anna Brennan, Thomas's wife, the mother of his coming child. She was the woman who'd stumbled into his life half dead and turned it into something worth living again. She was his second chance, and he was hers. "I love you," Thomas said into the darkness. "I love you too," Anna replied. "Whatever I was before, whatever name I had, whatever life I lived, this is who I'm meant to be. Here with you." And in that moment, under the vast Montana sky with stars wheeling overhead, a new life growing between them, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest gift wasn't getting back what you'd lost. It was finding something new you never knew you needed. The past would keep its secrets. But the future was theirs to write, together. So what do you think? Can love truly conquer the mysteries of the past? Can two people build a life together without knowing where they came from? Can you choose your own identity when your memories are lost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about Thomas and Anna's journey, and whether you believe she was Elizabeth, Sarah, or someone else entirely. What would you have done in their place? Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.